You're watching a special edition on Jimmy Carter's state funeral in Washington this Thursday. Now, we just heard a choral arrangement of The Road Home by American composer Stephen Paulus, a remarkably reflective spiritual piece. And then we also heard from Reverend Andrew Young, who is not only a longtime friend of Jimmy Carter, but also the UN ambassador to the United Nations. The early parts of this ceremony, then, deeply spiritual for both of my guests on set, Doug and former Foreign Service officer William Jordan, reflecting perhaps Jimmy Carter's own spirituality.
Well, exactly. And in fact, to go back to what you asked Douglas earlier, I mean, the word I would use to describe Carter is honorable. And that comes in part from the fact that being a Southerner and having been raised in the Southern Baptist tradition, and I come from the South, so not far from Plains, Georgia myself, so I know something about this milieu and this tradition. Carter was always imbued with the idea of doing the right thing, doing the good thing. Whether you agreed with what it was he was trying to do, whether you agreed with how he did it, whether and as Douglas was saying, Carter's political legacy, certainly while he was president, is still contested. A lot of it looks better 40-odd years later after looking at the record of his successors. But the thing that always was central to Jimmy Carter, who, as many people have pointed out, taught Sunday school throughout most of his life until the very end, and when he could no longer do so, it was this idea of service to others, of doing the right thing, and of being somebody who was doing something not just for himself, but for his fellow man and woman.
Speaking of him doing the right thing, and because you say you come from the South, like Jimmy Carter, I think it's important to point out the relationship that he had, especially in the Deep South, born in 1924, to some of the African-American laborers who worked on his farm. He took pride in having real relationships with them and helping them through financial difficulties. And how atypical was that from someone from the Deep South at that period of time in the United States?
Well, you're probably potentially getting into a difficult area to describe, but I would say that certainly white Southerners in small towns like Plains always had a certain sense, even if they were not believers in integration and racial harmony, they believed, again, this principle of doing the right thing. They did what they could. I mean, my grandfather living in Alabama growing up in Alabama was a pharmacist who would often donate drugs to poor sharecroppers, black sharecroppers in his town. He was, however, very racist in terms of how he viewed things. I think Jimmy Carter's whole story, though, is much different, and it's probably similar to my father's. Namely, if you grew up as a child and you were in constant contact with and you mixed with people of other races, it was easier for you as you grew older to shed a lot of this racism that was so fundamental to at least older generations whose memories may not have directly gone back to the Civil War, but whose parents and grandparents would have probably been much more so. So that, to me, I think is important to remember in Carter. I mean, he was an important figure in his small town, and he grew up never having any complexes in terms of his interactions with African Americans.
And I think maybe William could correct me if I'm wrong, but the actual farm, right, was not in Plains itself. It was in a small little hamlet. It was called Archery, which I don't think it exists anymore today. It was near Plains, but the actual physical location, the neighbors in that area were predominantly, if not all, black neighbors, where Carter actually grew up. And so regularly as a kid, you could see this in his biographies, he played with black children. You know, what William was just saying, it was a part of the culture, your upbringing. It just was the normal for you. You might not say it was always the normal in the South, but in Carter's own particular childhood experience, that was the upbringing. And there was, I guess, what might seem like a paradox, that dichotomy between sort of, the fact that he played with black children and yet, his parents in public life perhaps had different views. It's not to say that they were outright segregationists, but there was definitely something within the culture in which he grew up where you go into the town, you read this in a lot of the biographies of people who grew up in the Deep South at a certain era, go into the town, and there was still, yes, it was, the civil rights movement hadn't really yet kicked in at all. And there was, black people in public life were really sort of separate, right, from white people. And in town, you didn't really mix. And yet you could have that coexisting with the fact that Jimmy Carter, in his own farm experience growing up, even if in the town you weren't mixing the white and the black people when you went into Plains, in his own farm, he was playing with the black children, the black neighbors' children. And his parents perhaps were friends with the black neighbors.
And he took great pains in his memoirs, if I may, to really emphasize the relationships that he had to some of the African Americans who were working on his farm. He said that he really took great strides to even replicate their manner of speech. Jimmy Carter, in his own words, saying, "It was only natural for me to consider myself the outsider and to strive to emulate their habits and language." Again, there's this theme of the outsider that's really constant throughout Jimmy Carter's life.
Well, again, I think Jimmy Carter always understood that, especially if you're talking about in terms of national politics, was that he existed in a space that almost no others who reached either the presidency or national levels of prominence had done. I mean, he was very much cast against type, so to speak, and so. Some could argue that was one of the things that made him that hurt him, because I do think that it probably made him. I do think that was one of the areas where his ego may have gotten in the way in some respects, because I think he always believed that he might have had a certain special moral vision that others didn't see or didn't have, and but absolutely, I mean, I think that. It's one of the things that made Carter both unique when he came up and different when he was president. It may not have been so much the case of being all that different as governor of Georgia, but I don't think Americans were at all used to seeing somebody as deeply Southern in the White House, with the exception of Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson. I'm not a Texan. Texans might disagree with me, but there was something that was very Texan about Lyndon Johnson as opposed to Jimmy Carter, which was very Southern, and I think speaks a lot about just about every Southern state to the east of Texas all the way up to Virginia.
Well, just as a reminder to our viewers, as you see these live pictures of Jimmy Carter's state funeral, we just heard from his grandson, Joshua Carter, who read from the book of Romans. And in the coming moments, we will also hear from Stephen Ford, the son of former President Gerald Ford, as well as tributes from Ted Mondale, the son of former Vice President Walter Mondale. Let's turn to you now, Doug.
Yeah, I was just going to pick, something that William was saying. I think in the case of Carter being a Southerner, from Georgia, from a part of Georgia that was, he wasn't from Atlanta, Georgia. He was from a conservative part of Georgia, to be able to run for president in 1976. And there probably, were precursors to his announcement that he was going to run that made it possible, really, that created a climate in which it was feasible for a man of his background and his beliefs to run, right? So the fact that we mentioned LBJ, that he had already been, a president who was very much activist in pushing for some landmark legislation where it came to voting rights, civil rights in general. He was very activist on that, and the civil rights movement as a whole. All of these, you could say, to varying degrees, helped to lay the groundwork, helped to make it possible for an American electorate to take seriously the prospect of a Southerner, there had not been too many since the Civil War, right, to be able to declare candidacy for president and to be taken seriously. And obviously, the climate in which he was running, coming right off the heels of both the Vietnam War, one of the most divisive experiences in American history, one of the most, at least in modern times, and coming off of Watergate. A lot of cynicism about and distrust of government, politicians, and all that. You have a man who comes along and basically believes I think government should be as good as its people. People, saying things like that. What I was saying earlier, I will not tell a lie. And he had his whole persona, his whole demeanor. When people heard Jimmy Carter say that, he sounded credible. It didn't just sound like a politician spewing anything that he needed to get elected. I think there was a sense of credibility in his statements on the campaign trail.
And despite that, I think arguably his honesty, his transparency with the American population is also perhaps arguably what made his presidency complicated and what meant that he wasn't necessarily as popular as one would have thought. There was the infamous Melez speech 2 years into his presidency. Why did that not translate well to the American public?
Well, before I answer that, let me just say, in picking up on this point of doing the right thing as he saw it, because Douglas made some very important points a couple seconds ago, and that is, one of the first things that Carter did when he came into office was he pardoned all of these people who had fled the draft. Talking about Vietnam and the great divisions that had aroused. That was extremely controversial. I mean, there are still people in the United States, especially those who fought in Vietnam, who resent Carter for that. But it sort of set the tone in a way for how Carter was going to act. I always thought it was very interesting that despite having basically won in 1976 on the basis of the unhappiness over Gerald Ford's pardon of Richard Nixon for things during Watergate, that he praised Gerald Ford during his inauguration address for having basically done everything that he could to keep the country together, to keep the country united. And I think that, moving ahead to the famous Melez speech, in which everybody points out the word Melez was never actually used, that was an example of Carter trying to do something that hadn't really been done from the White House since Franklin Roosevelt, which was have these, what they called fireside chats, these sorts of regular heart-to-heart talks with the American people. In fact, Carter never had them as frequently as I think he wanted to. I don't think they necessarily went over that well. One of the reasons why I think the Melez speech did not go over well was it reflected too much of Jimmy Carter and sort of how he would speak maybe in Sunday school and maybe to members of his family about what he
a
saw
father
was
almost disciplining children.
Right. If I can put it in the current context, it's almost a bit like how sometimes I feel Emmanuel Macron speaks to the French people. And many commentators have recently pointed out that he came across as a downer, to use the term of the time. He seemed to be sketching all the reasons why things were going bad, but he didn't really leave one with an optimistic sense that we'll get over it. Well, here's what I'm planning to do to change it. It was more like he was saying, we got to face this, we got to deal with it. We'll come back from it, but we've got to at least recognize it. And I'm not sure the American people, for all the reasons Douglas mentioned earlier, with the economy being as it was and with the international situation becoming increasingly turbulent. And if I remember correctly, I think the Melez speech came out around a time when employment was high, stagflation was the order of the day, and you may have started to have the first inklings of the second energy crisis, which was causing gas prices to rise, which is always a very difficult time for Americans. So I just think it was, unfortunately, that was arguably too much of Carter overriding his speechwriters and insisting upon dictating things the way that he wanted them to be, which of course led in part to his defeat in 1980 because Ronald Reagan was the exact opposite. He may not have said very much of substance, but he generated a feeling of optimism and hope for the future.
The shining city on the hill. His rhetoric was
what Americans wanted to hear.
Absolutely, diametrically opposed to what the Melez message that William was talking about right there. He would start speeches. It might have actually been the so-called Melez speech where he said, I have something unpleasant to talk to you about tonight. You know, who people don't like to hear that from the politician. Some commentators have said Jimmy Carter was too honest for his own good. I mean, sure, it's great. You know, you should be an honest politician, right? Who's going to argue against honesty, transparency? But he just did it too much. He didn't. Perhaps it's more accurate to say that he had a common touch with people. He was an early populist in a sense. He knew how to play the populism card very well, speaking over the head of the Washington elite. He was an outsider speaking directly to the people. But he didn't really have a political touch, and he didn't really know he really didn't seem to know how Washington itself worked, or if he did know, he didn't want to play the game at all. And he didn't take care of the Democrats in Congress. He didn't soothe his allies. You know, he didn't soothe their egos at all. Politicians in Washington, if you ever worked there, been there, they expect that. It's just part of the nature of doing business in Washington. It's not even that cynical to say it. It's just the way that whole machine works. Jimmy Carter didn't play that game. You could say to his credit, but he didn't play it because he didn't know how or he didn't want to. And he did suffer as a result. Ultimately, he came in as one of the most wildly popular presidents, approval ratings above 70%. He had one of the most dismally abysmal approval ratings when he left office, I think was in the mid-20s.
It's interesting to go back to this idea of the Melez speech, because I think in many elements of it will really resonate with the left today, especially in the United States. He encouraged Americans to consume less, not only energy, but just to not be to think more about their consumption habits. These are things that you would think we would hear more frequently, especially from politicians today. And it still seems that the American public, the public in general, perhaps is no more ready to hear the hard truths. And that's perhaps what led, at least in part, to Jimmy Carter's inability to curry favors with people who otherwise would have been his allies.
Well, let's not forget that Melez's speech came out in the heyday of the disco era, when hedonism, a certain amount of decadence, and a desire to party like the end of the world is coming tomorrow, was very much on people's minds because they were trying to escape this reality. I think that again, Jimmy Carter, let's remember, Jimmy Carter lived in the same house that he grew up in, even after he was president. He knew a lot of the privations. He may have come from a prominent family in that hamlet of a town where he grew up, but he was by no means wealthy, and he knew what a hardscrabble existence was like. He eschewed a lot of the pomp and circumstance of the office, and I think he felt as though, and this is probably partly picking up on what Douglas was talking about, where he ran aground with the Washington elite. He seemed to feel as though everybody else in Washington should hew to his way of doing things rather than the other way around. He didn't like to go around courting other people. He felt as though people should accept, both because of the force of his office as well as the force of his arguments, that they should accept what it was that he wanted to do. So he tended to be pretty uncompromising. Despite all of that, I mean, he did accomplish an awful lot. His legislative record is very impressive. But again, I remember all of this very well because my own personal politics was far to the left of Jimmy Carter. And I was very chagrined that he couldn't seem to find common ground with people in his own party who I believe thought that when he was elected in 76, having a Democrat, leave aside for a second Jimmy Carter, but having a Democrat back in the White House was going to allow Democrats to sort of restore the momentum and the substance of what they had started to do under Lyndon Johnson with creating the Great Society. That wasn't Jimmy Carter's agenda necessarily. I mean, he wasn't necessarily opposed to it, but he wasn't prepared to go as far as some of the people on the left of the party, like, again, a name that doesn't mean anything to a lot of people, Hubert Humphrey, who was a former vice president and presidential candidate in 1968, former Vice President Lyndon Johnson wanted to do. Carter bucked that. Carter wanted, as I said, to be honest to the American people and say, we can't expect to do everything that we could have done before because we don't necessarily have the means. and let's just accept that and try to make the best with what we have. Again, not a very positive or uplifting message to many people who just began increasingly to feel, and it's important to remember, this is the period of what is called deindustrialization here in Europe. It was happening in the United States. A lot of the Rust Belt in the United States came about as a consequence of economic forces in the 1970s that overwhelmed every presidency from Richard Nixon all the way through to the early years of Ronald Reagan. In fact, today the ruins of that period are still there. And Jimmy Carter trying to convince steel workers and auto workers and other people in industry in the United States, manufacturing industry in the United States, that they needed to figure out how to deal with a new reality wasn't necessarily what they wanted to hear, and it wasn't necessarily what the Democratic establishment in Washington wanted to project to the American people thinking about the next round of elections.